Logan stood holding the door open for Stacy at the Mounties' office. She hesitated for a few seconds before stepping inside. Her face was solemn and her eyes were still a little bloodshot from crying that morning. But Logan had made it quite clear to her that she needed to let the police know as soon as possible that she was the hobo's next of kin. The RCMP officer was rifling through a drawer at his desk when they walked in, but he stood up and came over to the counter. "Are you all good, Stacy?" he asked, looking down at her with a slightly concerned expression on his face. "As good as I'm gonna get, Jason. I've come here to see ya about my pa. It seems he's gone and roasted himself in Barker's old barn the other night." The Mountie wasn't too sure how he should respond to this rather blunt statement. He had only known Stacy for a short time. However, he was well aware of the past sheriff's demise, and he wanted to tread carefully when replying to a somewhat violent young woman. "So, let me get this straight. You are the daughter of the fatality at Barker's farm on July the 13th. "Ain't that what I just told you?" Stacy replied, shouting at him in a cold stare. "Well, only in so many words, Stacy. I am very sorry for your loss. I will, however, need some details linking you to the deceased. If you could tell me his full name first, that would be a good start." "Patrick Summers. I never knew if he had any middle names. He left when I was just a kid, so I don't know much about him. All I have is a memory of this here pendant." Stacy took the chain from around her neck and placed the carved stone bear pendant onto the counter. Jason looked down at it briefly before turning around and heading to the filing cabinet in the corner of the room. He soon returned holding a small plastic bag, which he had placed next to Stacy's pendant. There was no mistaking the connection between the two items. The small stone bear fit neatly between the legs of the large carved bear in the plastic bag. Going by this fresh evidence, I should be able to finalize a few details in our investigation. The statement Logan gave the sheriff the other night about the victim before his death and the connection between the pendants seem to be the only solid lead we have that the deceased was indeed your father. I will have to make a few more inquiries, though, but this evidence is a huge help. Thank you, Stacy. Stacy looked at the Mountie blankly for a minute before replying. "So does that mean I can start organizing my pa's funeral? I guess I'm all he has. Before my mom died some years back, she told me Pa never had any family except us. Once I have checked his birth records, driver's license, etc., I'll get back to you as soon as I can, Stacy. And again, I am so sorry for your loss." "It is not your fault. My old man was a darn fool. My mom told me he smoked like a chimney. Anyways, I've got work to be getting on with. I'll be seeing you later, I guess," she answered, picking up the pendant from the counter and fastening it back around her neck. The Mountie nodded in acknowledgement as he took up the plastic bag and returned it to the filing cabinet. For the rest of that day, Stacy barely said 2 words to Logan, and if she did, it was only about work. Then come supper time, she slapped the dish of poutine down on the table so hard that it made the cutlery jump. Logan remained silent during this time. There was little point in trying to comfort her. Once she had gotten over the initial shock of her pa's death, now came the anger for what had occurred. Nothing Logan could say nor do was going to stop her from going through this stage of grief. He knew if he did say anything, he'd just wear the end of her sharp tongue anyway. The following morning, Jason turned up at the garage in his patrol car. He let Stacy know she was able to go ahead with arrangements for her pa's funeral. Everything had been finalized, and she would receive a copy of her father's death certificate in due course. 2 days later, Stacy held the funeral for her pa. Given Patrick was unknown in the town, the only mourners consisted of the fire chief, a couple of the crew, the sheriff, and of course, Logan. The only non-emergency service personnel, other than Stacy, was dear old Mrs. Jacobs. She came armed with 2 large pies, maple, pecan, and blackberry, and apple. After the official proceedings were over, these treats were soon devoured by the mourners. This act of kindness on Mrs. Jacobs' behalf was the first time Logan had seen a smile on Stacy's face before reading of her pa's death. "You are very kind, Mrs. Jacobs. Your pies are the best in Clairsham, and don't you listen to anyone who says otherwise," Stacy said, while giving the old lady a hug. "You are too kind, Stacy. I am so sorry you lost your pa in such a cruel way," she replied, hugging the young woman in return. "It's okay, Mrs. Jacobs. He was a stranger to me in many ways. These past 6 years living in Clairsham had been my happiest memories. I ain't gonna let my pa's death change that now. In fact, I'm determined to join the fire department because of it." Upon hearing this statement, the fire chief and crew members turned around from the conversation they were having and stared at Stacy with a slight look of shock on their faces. Logan hadn't gotten around to letting the chief know about Stacy's plan to join the fire department, so his declaration came clear out of the blue. "Well, don't be looking at me all surprised. I ain't the first gal who wanted to join the fire department, am I?" Stacy stated as she stared back at the men intently. No, not at all, Stacy. You are welcome to come and see me at any time about joining up. I guess we are a little surprised at your news, is all," the fire chief replied quickly. "Well, I have been thinking on it for some time now. I didn't quite know about how to go about joining, but with Logan being a volunteer and all, I figured now is as good a time as any. Also, seeing as I am usually woken up when he gets paged anyways, I may as well join y'all." When Stacy said this, she turned her gaze upon her apprentice mechanic. Logan gave a half-hearted grin in return. He wasn't sure if his boss was teasing him or being serious. "Well, good for you, Stacy," the chief said, trying to remain impartial to the idea of her joining his crew. "Come along to a training night with Firefighter Wells when you are ready, and I'll take you through the steps of becoming a volunteer." Logan then recalled what the fire chief had said to him on his first night at the fire hall. He referred to Stacy as being harder to work with than a rattlesnake. This comment worried Logan a little. If Stacy made it through the interview and basic training, she might find some opposition from the rest of the crew. He hoped that his concerns were wrong, and that she would be treated with the same respect as everyone else. Most of all, though, he wanted her to keep her cool. There was no room for hotheads in the fire department, and Stacy's ability to unleash her anger on anyone who crossed her had him worried. Life soon returned to normal at the garage. Logan actually started to enjoy working for Stacy. There was nothing she couldn't put her hand to fixing, whether it be an automobile, tractor, or even the occasional motor mower. No job seemed too big or small for the capable mechanic. In the weeks after the funeral, she had made no mention of joining Logan on training nights at the fire hall. In some ways, he was quite pleased about this, because he still wasn't 100% sure how her presence would be felt by the all-male crew. One morning after breakfast, Stacy was reading the newspaper in her usual spot at the table, when she suddenly let out a happy cry. "I found it," she stated with a huge smile. "Found what?" Logan asked with interest. "My dream car. Well, the makings of one, anyway." Stacy flipped the newspaper around so that Logan could read the advertisement she had just circled in pen. Ford Mustang Mach 1, 1973. Body only, no rust. Offers. Logan looked up at Stacy with a confused expression. "What about the rest of the car?" he said. "I don't need the rest of the car. I've been looking for a body in good condition for the past 2 years. Come with me and I'll show you." Logan got up from the table and followed Stacy to the back of the garage. She led him towards a wooden shed in the far end of the property. He had seen the shed often, but he had never asked her what was kept in it. Stacy rummaged through her jeans pockets and pulled out a key. After a couple of attempts at opening the rusted padlock, she told Logan to stay put while she grabbed a can of CRC. With a couple squirts into the barrel of the padlock, it was finally prized open. Stacy pulled the door back, and there in the light of the doorway sat an extremely rusted out 1973 Mach 1 Mustang. The body is shot on this old wreck, but the engine and chassis are salvageable. I was just waiting for a suitable replacement to show up so I could start fixing her up, Stacy said with a broad smile. "Do you want to help me restore her?" "Sure thing, Stacy. That'd be awesome," Logan replied as he surveyed the wreck with interest. "Cool. Well, I'll go ring the seller. I guess I can leave you in charge of the garage while I go collect the car. I should be back before 7 o'clock. Will that leave me enough time to join you at training tonight?" Logan raised an eyebrow, looking at Stacy inquiringly. "Do you think you are ready, Stacy?" "Can't see why not. There's no use dwelling on the what-ifs, and I figure if we are going to work on the Mustang together, I may as well get the practical firefighter training out of the way first." Logan smiled outwardly, but inside his fears were brewing away like an old copper kettle. Stacy returned to the garage just before 6:45. Logan walked out of the workshop and ran his eyes over the Mustang's bodywork. It was indeed tidy for its age, although the red paintwork looked tired and in need of a respray. "Are you planning on keeping this color?" Logan couldn't help but asking. "No, I figured I'd paint it metallic blue with white racing stripes, seeing as blue is my favorite color," she replied happily. "I may as well leave it on the back of the truck for now. We need to be getting to the fire hall, don't we?" 10 minutes later, Stacy and Logan walked into the truck bay at the fire hall, where they were met by the captain. He had been unable to attend the funeral, but he had obviously been told about Stacy wanting to join up, because he was not surprised to see her. "Hey Stacy, I guess you are here to see the chief. He's in his office. But can you do me a favor when you are done seeing him? The pump's transmission is sounding a little rough, and as you are here, I was hoping you could take a quick look at it." "Yeah, sure thing, Daniel. Captain," Stacy replied a little awkwardly. Logan had already warned her she would have to call the senior crew by their title, instead of referring to them by their Christian names, as she had done for years. Logan showed Stacy to the chief's office, and she knocked on the open door lightly to get his attention. The chief asked her to come inside and closed the door. Stacy took a sidewards, nervous glance at Logan and did as the chief had asked. Logan chuckled quietly to himself as he made his way back to help the other crew with the vehicle checks. He had never seen Stacy look nervous before. It actually surprised him a little. He wondered if she was anxious that the town gossip might have suddenly become her demise when speaking to the chief. Logan remembered back to his first interview when joining the fire department and thought he might be reading into Stacy's reaction too much. He had been a mess of nerves when he first faced the fire chief while applying to become a firefighter. An hour later, the chief and Stacy rejoined the rest of the crew. She seemed back to her normal, confident persona while she checked over the pump. Stacy told the captain that it needed a service, and she could fit it in the next afternoon if someone wanted to drop the truck around to their workshop. From that day on, everything got extremely busy for Stacy and Logan. Once the police check had come through for Stacy, the fire chief informed her she would be placed into the next available course for trainee firefighters. Given that it was a 12-week course, she had to make sure that Logan was up to speed with running the garage in her absence. Stacy wasn't concerned about letting Logan take charge. He was a quick learner, and apart from the most complex of jobs, he was able to strip down and rebuild an engine with ease. It took him a little longer to figure out all the paperwork side of the business, but by the time Stacy had to leave, Logan had mastered that task as well. Over the following weeks, Logan kept in contact with Stacy through video calls. He couldn't help noticing as each week went by, she looked more and more tired, yet Stacy seemed happy within herself. As far as things went at the garage, Logan was managing just fine. He was being well looked after by Mrs. Jacobs, who called by on numerous occasions to deliver hot meals and scrumptious pies. I swear, Stacy, I won't be able to get into my turnout gear soon, Logan joked on one call they shared. The way Mrs. Jacobs is going, she won't ever have to pay for her car being serviced again, Stacy replied with a large smile. Time went by extremely fast over those 12 weeks, and as quickly as the course had started, it was completed. Stacy was now a qualified firefighter, but happy to be back at the garage. She wasted no time on the first day getting back into her daily routine. That evening after supper, she again put on her overalls and headed back to the shed to start working on the Mustang. Logan offered to join her, but no sooner had they started to dismantle the body from his chassis than Logan's pager sounded. "You coming, Stacy? The captain has already set up your gear in the locker next to mine. He's going to show you it on training nights," Logan said quickly as he made for the door. Stacy didn't have to be asked twice, and she threw down her wrench she was holding and raced after him. It wasn't long before they were seated in the pump vehicle, responding to a fire alarm activation on the other side of town. Stacy sat poker-faced in the back seat next to Logan. He smiled at her reassuringly. Most of the time, these fire alarm calls are nothing more than a reset. Nothing too exciting for your first response. However, when the truck pulled up outside their location, there was smoke bellowing from the eaves of the house in front of them. "Guess you were wrong," she said with a slight grin, as they jumped out of the vehicle. The captain told Logan to start a primary check and for Stacy to double check behind him, while the other firefighters started readying the equipment. A neighbor arrived on scene just as the pair was returning to the captain with their findings. It appeared that the couple who owned the house were in Ottawa at a wedding. Armed with this new information, the firefighters felt a little more at ease at the chance of finding anyone trapped inside. However, they were taking nothing for granted, and the captain instructed Logan and Stacy to enter the structure at the entry point they had established. Armed with the fire hose, the pair quickly made their way around the back of the house. Logan knocked the door down, and they blasted a jet of water inside before entering the dwelling on their hands and knees. They were soon followed by 2 more firefighters, and between the 4 of them, the house was soon cleared and the fire knocked. The crew rolled up the hoses and packed their gear back into the truck. The captain commended his crew on a job well done, and they made their way back to the fire hall. Winter was particularly cold in southern Alberta that year. After the hot, dry weather they had experienced over summer, the temperatures were the extreme reverse now, with several blizzards already plummeting the mercury below -40. Summer seemed a lifetime away, yet Stacy was determined to get the Mustang up and running before it arrived. Logan spent time working on the car with Stacy in the evenings. There was no heating in the back shed, so Stacy moved things around in the workshop to make room for her prized possession. Some nights, it was impossible to spend time on the car, because the pagers would go off and the pair would have to down tools and head for the fire hall. One such night, they attended 2 calls in a row. The wind was blowing the snow in all directions, which made driving even more dangerous for the fire crew, as they navigated their way along the snow-covered highway to their location. They finally arrived at the scene of a 3-car pileup. Stacy hopped out of the rescue vehicle to check for any downed wires and to disconnect the batteries from the vehicles, while Logan and one other crew went around to check for casualties and then cribbed the cars by placing chocks underneath them. It soon became apparent to the crew that one of their own firefighters was in the middle of this carnage. At the end of their previous call, Steve had told them that he was driving around to his mom's place because she was having a problem with her furnace. Now he was trapped inside his car, which was sandwiched firmly between two of their vehicles. He was conscious, but in a lot of pain. Sadly, the fire crew was all he had for the moment. It'd be some time before any medics arrived on scene because they were already out on a job. Once the crew had confirmed all the airbags had been deployed, Dave, the medical attendant, suggested with Stacy's small frame she could climb through the smashed back window and hold Steve's C-spine, while he went to get a stiff neck collar from the truck. Meanwhile, the other firefighters were setting up the cutting equipment to free Steve from the wreckage. The drivers of the other 2 cars were shaken up and suffered from whiplash and a few cuts and bruises, but apart from that, they were doing okay. Stacy managed to lever herself through the window and squeeze into the tight space behind the driver's seat. She did her best to comfort Steve and keep him talking, while she placed her hands on either side of his neck to hold it still. He kept saying he couldn't feel his legs, and he had a sharp pain in his left arm. Stacy looked down and saw an open fracture of the radius and ulna. "We will have you out soon, Steve, and they will fix you up in no time," Stacy said in a reassuring voice. "How are the other folk doing?" he asked, between gritted teeth. "They're doing just fine." "Can you remember what happened?" she asked, trying to keep him conscious. "There was a car stopped dead on the road in front of me. I came mighty close to hitting them, but stopped in time. I put on my hazard lights and was just about to get out and check on them when I got hit from behind. It all happened so fast. I didn't even see the lights of the car coming up behind me. Well, given this blizzard is so intense, it was lucky you managed to stop short of them first off. I can't remember the last time we had a snowstorm this bad. I'm worried about my mom. Who's going to get her furnace going now?" Steve said in a faint voice. "I'll call by and see her when we get back to the fire hall, Steve." "You need to think about yourself just now," Stacy replied kindly. "You know the worst part, Stacy? I have just let the insurance lapse on my car. I am such a fool." "Worry about that later, Steve. As long as you're doing all right, that is all that matters. Cars get replaced, people don't." Dave soon returned, and reaching through the driver's window, he positioned a collar around Steve's neck. He then handed Stacy a cover to put over both of them, while the crew chopped off the roof of the car. Logan shoved the spreader into place in the door frame so they could make room for the jaws of life to cut the driver's door free. Stacy looked over at him briefly with a solemn expression on her face as the extent of Steve's leg injury was revealed. There was a compound fracture of his right femur, which normally would be extremely painful for the patient, but given the fact that he couldn't feel much at all was a concern for the crew. He may well have a spinal injury, and they needed to be extremely careful on how they extracted him from the vehicle. Given the extreme weather conditions, they had already been advised there was no way the STARS air ambulance could risk flying, but thankfully they soon heard sirens drawing closer to their location, and 2 ambulances soon drove into view. With everything in place and pain relief administered, Steve was gently removed from the wreckage and was soon in the warmth of an ambulance, along with the 2 other drivers who were going in the other ambulance to be checked out at the hospital just as a precaution. The crew watched as their friend was driven away. Then they set about clearing up the mess left behind. After the call, as promised, Stacy and Logan cautiously drove over to Steve's mom's house. It was still snowing heavily and visibility was really bad, but Stacy was determined to keep her word to Steve. Mrs. Thompson was wrapped up in a blanket and in tears when she answered the door. The RCMP had contacted her to let her know about the accident, but her car was buried underneath a thick cover of snow, and she had no way of getting to the hospital. Stacy asked Logan to make Mrs. Thompson a sweet cup of tea while she sorted out the problem with the furnace. "Once I get your furnace working again, Mrs. Thompson, we'll take you over to the hospital so you can be with your son. He made me promise I would get your house warm, though, so I'd best be getting onto that right away," Stacy said in a kind voice. "Bless you, Stacy," the grateful woman replied, sinking into the soft armchair of the lounge and wrapping the blanket tightly around herself. Half an hour later, Stacy and Logan left Mrs. Thompson in the hospital lounge. Steve was in the theater and would probably be there for some time yet, so it seemed pointless to hang around waiting. On the way back to the garage, Logan couldn't help looking over at Stacy and smiling. "You want to know something, Stacy?" he said in a casual voice. "Only if it ain't about something I did wrong tonight," she replied blankly. "On the contrary, despite the fact that when I first met you, I was a little weary that you might bite my head off, but in all reality, you are actually the biggest softie I've ever met." Stacy took her eyes from the road for a second and glanced at Logan, with a wry grin on her face. "Well, just don't be letting that little secret out of the bag, mister, because I have a reputation to keep in this town." "I wouldn't dream of it, boss," Logan replied, grinning back at her. The winter months slowly ticked by, and then spring came with a flurry of new life and warm sunshine. Steve was making good progress in his recovery. Thankfully, his back injury was an incomplete spinal cord contusion, and with rehabilitation, he was on his feet again and started to walk unaided. He would not be able to carry on as a volunteer firefighter anymore, but the crew were grateful that he had managed to pull through his harrowing ordeal. During the period of his recovery, Logan and Stacy spent time keeping him company, first at the hospital and then at his mom's place. Even though they had known Steve for a long time, they were more acquaintances than close friends. But after the crash, that all changed. Over this time, the Mustang had gone from a pile of junk to a very classy-looking machine. The day finally came for Stacy to drive her car out of the workshop and into daylight. The metallic blue paint glistened in the sunlight, and the V8 engine purred under the hood like a contented pussycat. Stacy looked over at Logan, who had come outside to see what she was doing. "Good timing," she said to him, as he walked around the Mustang to get a better look at it in the open air. "I want you to follow me in the tow truck while I take her for a spin." Logan seemed a little surprised at this request. Having worked on the car with Stacy, he would be very shocked if it missed a beat. Everything had been checked off many times, and it was running perfectly. But he didn't question his boss, and he went to get the keys to the truck. A few minutes later, they were cruising down the highway. Stacy put her foot on the gas, and the Mustang pulled away from the tow truck like a rocket. She eased off the pedal and pulled over to wait for Logan to catch up to her. Once he had pulled in behind her, she got out of the car grinning. Just as well we saw the sheriff back in town, because that could have been an expensive quarter mile. I have always wanted to do that, and now I have. I think we should take the car around to show Steve, given we have been telling him about it all this time. You sweet with that? Logan nodded in reply, and they moved off again at normal speed limit. Steve was in the front yard with his mom when Stacy and Logan pulled up. "Wow, Stacy, she is beautiful," Steve said, as he ran a finger along the smooth paintwork. "Yeah, she is something, isn't she?" Stacy replied. "I met your mom outside the bank the other day. She told me you were inside applying for a loan to get yourself another car." "Yeah, well, I figured it was time I got behind the wheel again. The driver that hit me in the crash didn't have any insurance either, and it has been an expensive lesson for me. But oh well, that is life." "Yeah, Life sucks like that at times, and then sometimes things have a way of making the bad just melt away. Today is one of those days. Stacy took the keys out of the Mustang's ignition and handed them to Steve. Get a hold of your bank tomorrow and tell them you don't need the loan anymore. You already have a car. But mind that you insure her, you hear? I can't take your car, Stacy, Steve said in total shock. You can, and you will, she replied, giving him one of her most determined stares. I enjoyed doing this car up so much. I'm going to find me another one. Your needs are greater than mine, and I will not accept no as an answer. Steve looked from Stacy to Logan, who stood there shrugging his shoulders and smiling. There is one thing I've learned in this time I've known Stacy. You never want to argue with her, Steve, because she's always going to win. The young man stood there with tears in his eyes. Don't start blubbering, Steve. You won't be able to see the road. Now get in and take us for a drive. I want to know what you think of her, Stacy said with a huge smile on her face. All three friends hopped into the Mustang and made off down the road, heading for the open highway under the endless, blue Alberta sky. The end.